This may be a ramble of thoughts, but after recently stumbling on this sub, I finally felt a place I could offer something that my family and I experienced a few years ago that to this day gives me a shiver. I have been camping, solo backpacking, and hunting my whole life in Oregon. I mostly felt comfortable in the woods and have deep respect for nature. A few years ago, my wife, daughter, and 2 German shepherds went camping north of Mount Jefferson, Oregon. I have included the coordinates of our campsite, which we found to be the perfect setup for us and our 2 dogs, who need privacy since they are intimidating to other dog owners and can be loud when spooked. It was not an established campsite, just a nice horseshoe off a USFS road that had flat ground full of trees and a fire pit. The first night, my daughter wanted to sleep by herself in a 2-man tent right next to ours. It was maybe 2 feet away from me and my wife's tent. We made the male German shepherd, Guts is his name, sleep with her in the tent. That whole first night neither my wife and I could sleep. We both heard footsteps and they were heavy, not like typical forest critters scampering around the night. I was well armed because I was paranoid from reading recently, before departing, about a dad in California who was shot and killed in a tent next to his 2 infant daughters. Needless to say, both my wife and I had 2 pistols and my rifle with me. The dogs are great at detection, and that is why I felt my daughter could sleep alone, because Guts is completely fearless and nothing would lay a hand on her without a battle to the death. All in all, nothing but bad vibes and loud footsteps occurred that night, which I ultimately decided was deer or maybe some elk. In the morning, we went for a walk down the road. After covering a few distance, I saw an abandoned road, with a rusted gate post covered in vegetation. Something of blue color caught my eye, and Guts immediately took off running down this abandoned road. My heart began to race because I think it was another family camping like us, and he was going to get himself shot or scare some innocent people to death, so I chased after him as fast as I can and the rest followed. He stops after 20 feet into the road and I was yelling his name, but I had covered just enough distance to see that there was nobody there, but I realized something was off about the sight. I yelled, "Hello, is anyone there?" "Sorry about the dog." I got no response. My curiosity got the best of me and I had to see what the site conditions were. As I got closer, I noticed something was wrong. It had all the necessities for a campsite, including a cooler, propane burner, tent, blankets, folding table, but every single item had been completely destroyed, smashed, and torn from what appeared to be claw marks. We all walked around in circles, puzzled why anyone would leave all their camping gear behind, including an expensive REI tent. I figured, well, someone left in a hurry, and animals got to the rest, as the only logical explanation. Still, a propane tank and cooler were flattened by something, and it certainly wasn't snowpack with tree coverage in that spot. As the afternoon rolled in, my daughter and I were playing bocce ball at the campsite, and my wife went walking maybe 70 feet north to do her business. I did not have a direct line of sight on her, but all of a sudden I saw Guts make a mad dash straight towards her. Normally, he would always be with me unless he was called over, and she didn't call for him. His speed and focus caught my attention. I knew something weird was happening, so I ran over there and my wife started jogging at me. I immediately drew my pistol. Guts had completely continued running another 100 feet into the forest before I called him and he stopped. My other dog, Leah, who never misses the opportunity to be the pack leader, was not taking point. I have had her for 7 years now, and this was the first time in her life she refuses to leave my daughter's side. She was all over her and attached to her at the hip. Again, anytime we hike or play, Leah is up front, bossing everything in her path, and pauses to look to see where we are and continues. I asked my wife what happened and she said, "I was trying to pee and all of a sudden I felt all my hairs raised. I felt someone was watching me, and then I saw Guts running towards me, so I just got up to move towards you." We spent 10 minutes looking for signs of anything and saw no trails, broken branches, nothing to point to what and where something went. We decided we will be spending one more night since it's too late to pack up and drive, but we will all be in the big tent together. Before we went to bed, I put a rope with a makeshift coin alarm around the perimeter of our campsite. I used a mint can, some coins, keys from our truck, and zip-tied it so anything hitting the rope gave a little jingle. Very unsophisticated, but it put my wife at ease. As I went to tie my last corner off at a tree near our tent, our third mystery item unveiled itself. It looks like someone has done the same exact thing I have done with a rope that was so old and brown. I didn't see it at first. It was broken and only a few pieces remained, but sure enough, it was tied at roughly the same height, 8 to 10 inches off the ground, and even had a few rusted washers on it. I immediately felt someone has stayed here before and put the same makeshift warning system on the same tree I am. Maybe 10 to 15 years ago, based on the condition of the rope. Perhaps my paranoia has now reached a new height, but I had to make sure the girls feel we are safe. When evening came around, I made them sit in the truck and I fired a clip of my .45 into the dirt as a signal to whatever was out there that we were armed. I reassured the girls that anybody listening to that now knows we have 2 wolves armed and we were too risky of a target, so we can sleep safely. That night, we heard no footsteps and the dogs never perked up and barked. We left early the next morning. Fast forward to today, I watched the Amazon Missing 411 Hunted documentary, and I noticed the cluster smack dab close to where we camped that weekend, and a flood of dread rushes me as I think of that mysterious abandoned campsite with the ripped tent and smashed cooler and cooktop. We have been camping since and have enjoyed the beauty of the NW, but there was something there, at place that possibly took or harmed someone else, less than 300 feet away from where we camped, and we all thank our lucky stars Guts was doing his thing so well that afternoon. Guts is no longer with us. He has journeyed into the next phase, and there isn't a day that goes by that I don't think about him and how he saved us. He was a warrior, and his new brother Geronimo is his spirit. This one took place almost 20 years ago. Back then, this parcel of land was owned by my dad and a business partner. It was essentially vacant, although we had taken on a few tenants who needed space to restore old sailboats or store industrial machinery. Being in a somewhat remote area, we were not immune to trespassers, and tenants would tell us about stolen tools or machinery parts often. This is where we met Dan. Dan came to my father much in the same way many others did. He had a boat restoration business and needed a place to work. He also asked if it would be okay if he slept on the property a few nights a week, under the guise of it saving him time commuting if he worked late on a project. This was mutually beneficial, as Dan seemed like a decent guy and it would be nice to have a presence there overnight. We let him have a reduced rent rate as compensation for him generally keeping an eye on the place. A few months later, Dan had built himself a little compound, a series of 3 sea containers in a horseshoe configuration with a little trailer in the middle. Over the same period of time, we noticed that Dan didn't seem to work. There were never boats there, and Dan's a few nights a week became every night. Soon after, the excuses for why he didn't have rent started coming in. Effectively, we had invited a squatter onto our property. Dan became the same people we wanted him to keep out. About a year later, Dan's mental health was starting to show its cracks. He went from polite to aggressive and bitter. He wasn't violent and was always very courteous to me personally. I was 23 at the time, but when he was asked about money and back rent, he would get defensive and start blaming my dad and his partner for why he couldn't pay. My dad wasn't afraid of anybody, but Dan made him nervous. My dad's partner had a friend who had recently dealt with a similar renter-turned-squatter situation, and when he called the police for assistance, he was thanked by the squatter with a bullet in his stomach. A few $1,000s back rent or an eviction, was not worth a gunshot to my dad, and we all felt that Dan was capable of snapping that way. So, we just kept Dan busy doing cleanup and random tasks, which he always did and remarkably well. One day, my dad asked me to run to the site for him as he was out of town. A tenant had called because it looked like someone had tried to cut through a piece of our fence, and we wanted to get eyes on it. I pulled onto the property where I was greeted by Dan. "Hey buddy," he yelled and waved. Dan was always very respectful to me, courtesy of which he had stopped showing my dad and his partner some time ago. "Hey Dan," I yelled back as I parked and got out of my car. "Come check this out," Dan replied and waved for me to step inside his little compound area. I was dying to see what was going on in there, honestly. I knew Dan was off, but I never felt intimidated or in danger. Just another weird guy. I walked over and Dan brought me next to one of the sea containers. Check this out. This sea container had a roll-up door on the side, instead of the typical latch and swing doors on the end. He rolls up the door to a wall. I look closer and he has welded a metal wall 2 feet into the sea container. "What am I looking at, Dan?" "Skirt down the pathway to the left," he says, and points. I look down the narrow pathway and see a small opening at the end. Maybe 4 feet high and 3 feet wide. Check it out. I really should not have gone in, but again, curiosity and that feeling of invincibility you have as a 23-year-old overshadowed my better judgment. I squeezed down the hall and through the door into the main hold of the sea container. The interior was painted deep red. Shag carpet had been poorly glued to the ground. On every wall and surface, broken pieces of mirror had been glued, and in the back, an old-style prison door had been welded in place, and behind it, a small round bed with shiny satin sheets. There are times when you can't really believe what you are seeing is real. The sensory overload of this enclosed place was too much. I don't know how long I stood there, but was snapped back to reality when Dan, standing right behind me, says, "I love to party in here." I hadn't even realized he followed me in. One good piece of advice my dad gave me when dealing with tricky situations was, always play along, as long as you are safe until a moment comes that you can get away fast and safely. I ran through the scenarios. I had done MMA and kickboxing in college. I'm not a small guy, but neither was Dan. Do I punch him and run, and risk God knows what? Are there weapons hidden in here? I decided on the path of least resistance. "Wow, Dan, this place is sick. I'll bet with some weed and some music you could just spend hours back here. Hey man, you should come back and we can hang in here together. It'd be wild," says Dan. His face softened as if he had just found a friend who got it. "Look Dan, I want to hang bad, but I came here to meet my dad, and he should be pulling up right now, so I have to go meet him." Dan shrugged and I walked past him, squeezing through pathways until I was back outside. I calmly walked to my car, got in, and left. I relayed the story to my dad and his partner, who thought it was odd, but due to the fear of potential violence from Dan, and both my dad and his partner weren't certain that Dan didn't know our home addresses, we didn't call the authorities. We did, however, keep a very close eye on Dan and actually brought in another tenant to stay the night and keep an eye, both on Dan and the property. Eventually, Dan decided to move on. One day we showed up and his containers were being loaded onto a shipper, but he was nowhere to be found. He had moved on, leaving behind only sea container footprints and 3 dumpsters worth of garbage. I told the police the story soon after, along with his name, and they said they would keep their ears out. But not knowing where he went, or if Dan was even his real name, there wasn't much they could do. In the time, since we have never had a visit from or heard from Dan, the only people I told this story to were my paintball friends at work, who would practice with me on this property, and knew Dan since we were always there, and coined the nickname Sex Dangeon Dan.